So obituaries are an obvious resource, but are we using them to their full potential? Obituaries are often tucked into funeral cards or funeral programs when we come across them in boxes, but maybe they got separated or they were just clipped individually. We've touched upon when obituaries pop up in people's records too. So funeral cards are a snapshot of what information is typically at the end of an obituary, in addition to the program for the service. You could learn about religious texts and passages and music that was important to the deceased. Obituaries can contain a ton of information to lead you to new places to look, a ton. But can is the most important word with obituaries. Anymore, it is too expensive to take out these long columns in the newspaper, and people are working with websites of the funeral home to post obituaries and comments there. And that didn't change throughout the years. As someone who used to spend way too much time on microfilm readers just looking up obituaries, half the time you would only get a death announcement saying that they passed on, and that was it. And then other times you would get an obituary that was 4 or 5 columns long. And that's no different than today. So some of the things that an obituary can tell us are the date and location of birth, parents' names. Sometimes it might say a parent's occupation if their parents were well known in a community. If the person was educated, what level of education. Might talk about the deceased person's occupation, who they married. And a lot of it is hobbies and organizations. It gets really important when we're talking about genealogical research to see what surviving family member and their locations, and it can tell you further relationships with other people to continue digging more on. And when it comes down to the location of interment, whether it's a cemetery attached to a church, or perhaps you can check with the minister, that can tell you more about their religious affiliation. Sometimes you'll get cause of death, but that's really dependent on the family and their choices. With the opioid epidemic, currently, there's not a lot of times that people are listing cause of death. Nowadays, sometimes listing COVID-19 or complications from COVID or a flu or pneumonia. At the turn of the 20th century, turn of the 19th century, sometime, the descriptions were very gory for obituaries that I've come across. I have at one point had a newspaper that I found where there was a skirmish in an inn, and a man was shot in the foot. And in each subsequent issue of the paper, we talked about the color and scenario of his gangrenous limb and how each segment was removed, until one day I saw and finally found the obituary from him. I also grew up in an area where there was a lot of mining, and unfortunately there were a lot of notes about children who had a fatal accident with dynamite that was left out. So it really just depends on the family that you're researching, their economic status, if they could afford a piece in the newspaper itself for what they were printing, and the scenario of the person that whether they felt the family was comfortable enough to talk about it in the newspaper. Those older obituaries are certainly much more flowery in their description of a person passing on through the great beyond pearly gates. And so reading through all that flowery older language and religious text to really get some of the information from that is also important too. And of course, all of this gives you info on where to look next. So looking at my great-grandmother's obituary, we see that she attended a 6-week summer course at an academy in 1920, and then she went on to attend a state normal school. She received her teaching certificate, and where she first taught, it tells you that she gave piano lessons for more than 50 years. She received all these different outstanding awards, different clubs that she was a member of. It talks about how her husband was a former manager of the store in Portage, Pennsylvania, and when he died, it talks about their children who are surviving, their grandchildren, and great-granddaughters. And then it goes on to talk about funeral arrangements.